G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I want to talk to you about Australia's limited future. I want to talk to you about how Australia is never any more than 7 weeks away from starvation, collapse and anarchy. Reading from the Australian newspaper, Friday, 16th of March 2018. The article heads page 2, Low fuel stocks a major security concern for vulnerable Australia. Exclusive by Simon Benson, National Affairs Editor. A report from the Government-Controlled Intelligence Committee has recommended Australia's record low emergency fuel reserves be listed as a critical national security issue, with the Home Affairs Department handed oversight to increase stocks. In a damning assessment of the country's internationally mandated fuel stocks reserved for times of war or global supply disruption, the Parliamentary Joint Committee of Intelligence and Security has raised concerns about Australia's vulnerability to regional geopolitical instability, such as the South China Sea dispute. It follows a similar assessment from the International Energy Agency, which last month raised the same concern in a 5-yearly report into Australia's energy sector. There are identified supply chain vulnerabilities in the fuel sector in Australia, and the committee is concerned that these risks are actively managed in the most appropriate manner, the report, which had bipartisan support, said. In particular, the committee considers there is a serious requirement to assess these vulnerabilities and test the effectiveness of any existing or potential risk mitigations, particularly in scenarios of heightened geopolitical tensions. The committee notes the need to examine Australia's security of fuel supply and dependence upon fuel from a national perspective, involving collaborative efforts between governments and industry. Australia has the lowest reserves of member countries of the IEA, which mandates that all countries should hold 90 days in reserve as a minimum. Australia has 43 days of supply. The CIS, Parliamentary Joint Committee Intelligence Service report into the government's proposed critical infrastructure bill, which is designed to quarantine identified critical assets from foreign ownership and sabotage, listed fuel infrastructure be included in the bill as a priority. The committee recommends that the Department of Home Affairs, in consultation with the Department of Defence and the Department of the Environment and Energy, review and develop measures to ensure Australia has a continuous supply of fuel to meet its national security priorities, the major recommendation said. The department should consider whether critical fuel assets should be subject to the Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill 2017. The committee chair, Liberal MP Andrew Hastie, said the government needed to view the issue in terms of national security rather than an economic concern. Quote, the free market assumptions that have shaped Australia's approach to our liquid fuel security are coming under increasing pressure from the rapidly changing strategic environment in the Asia-Pacific region, unquote, Mr Hastie told The Australian. Quote, we must consider all the risks and not presume upon the access of open, unfettered trade, especially as the power dynamics shift around us. Our fuel stocks are well below the mandated 90 days. We are out of step with every other Western democracy. Even New Zealand has greater fuel stocks than Australia. 50% of our imported diesel and 60% of our jet fuel comes through the South China Sea. That leaves Australia very vulnerable to coercion through a disruption of our liquid fuel supply. Labor members of the committee endorsed the recommendation. Deputy Chairman Labor MP Anthony Byrne said, quote, the bipartisan report indicates fuel security is as important as national security and has to be brought under a national security umbrella. The 5-yearly IEA report into Australia's energy sector, released in February, found that Australia was vulnerable to significant external supply shock. Quote, the country does not have public stock holdings and does not place a minimum stockholding obligation on its domestic oil industry, unquote, it said. Quote, Australia meets neither obligation, unquote, the report said. Quote, in 11 of the 12 months of 2012 and for all of 2013 to 2017, end-month stock levels were below the 90-day level. Stock levels as of 1 October 2017 were equivalent to only 48 days of net imports. Okay, now I'm sure there are some of you who think that that was an alarmist view. Well, allow me to unpack those figures and give you a bit of background, and I'm going to have to tell you that that was actually an optimistic and rose-coloured version of the situation. I first learned of this 5 years ago when the last IEA report came out, and here's the first big thing. That newspaper report mentioned 43 days and 48 days, giving the impression that we've got more or less 7 weeks worth of fuel in Australia. Well, kind of, sort of, if you shut one eye and squint out of the other. You see, there is a maximum of 29 days normal usage worth of bulk storage. The average holdings in those 29 days bulk storage tanks is 21 days, and twice per month, Australia's actual bulk storage of liquid transport fuel drops to 14 days worth. The rest, the difference between 29 days and 43 or 48 days, that's the fuel that's actually in the fuel tankers on the road. That's the fuel that's actually in the underground bunkers at the service stations, right? So, okay, they've massaged the figures to make it appear that we have more fuel stockpiled in bulk storage than we actually have, because they have counted all of the ready use fuel. Now, here's the thing. Australia has no oil refineries. Australia receives all its refined petrol, diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, bunker fuel for ships. All of it comes from a massive refinery complex in a place called Singapore. All the fuel in Australia comes into Australia by ship. And Australia, as a nation, does not own any bulk oil, petroleum, fuel tankers. We just don't have any fuel cargo ships. So we rely on the goodwill and the continued commercial availability of fuel being refined in Singapore and then shipped by foreign companies to Australia. That's a bit scary, actually. Not only, but also, if you don't have any diesel, then you can't carry coal on a train to the power station from the mine. If you don't have any diesel, you can't sit on a bulldozer and push coal into the power station. So your electric grid falls down if there's no diesel. If the grid falls down, no electricity in the cities, no street lights, no traffic lights, no mobile phone, no electric cooking, no electric refrigeration. Becomes a bit interesting. There is 72 hours worth of emergency healthcare in Australia because that's how much backup fuel there is for the generator at the hospitals. 72 hours, 3 days. Interesting figure, that 3 days. I live in a town in a shire where there are 10,000 people and 2 supermarkets. On the shelves in those 2 supermarkets at any one time, there are 9 meals for every person in the shire. 9,000 meals. That's 3 days. 3 meals a day for 3 days, 9 meals per person on the shelf. Everything in the supermarket is on 24-hour just-in-time delivery reorder. So if you buy a packet of peanuts, the cash register in the supermarket tells the supply chain warehouse computer at the next day, within 12 hours, a new packet of peanuts will be shrink-wrapped onto a cargo pallet, put on a truck and dispatched. So 3 days after the diesel runs out, all of Australia runs out of food. Well, that's okay. You might think, you know, we have the police, for example. They can keep order and maintain the rule of law, can't they? Well, actually, if you pay attention, not one police station in Australia maintains any stockpile of emergency fuel. No fire brigade maintains any stockpile of emergency fuel. The State Emergency Service doesn't maintain any stockpile of fuel. The Army, the Navy and the Air Force do not maintain any independent stockpile of fuel for an emergency. How do I know this? Well, I'm a member of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, and when we want to fill up the tanker, we drive to the service station and we use an RFS credit card. I have eyeballs and I watch what goes on when the New South Wales Police Force go out on road patrol, highway patrol. They drive out of the police station, they drive around the corner, and they pull up at the Bowser at the service station, and they pay for it with a government credit card. When the Army sends a convoy from Brisbane to Sydney or Sydney to Brisbane, they pull into the United Service Station and pay for their fuel with a government carnet card. The RAAF and the Navy are fueled by commercial operators. They don't maintain their own stockpiles. Why is it so? Well, the reason it's like this is because the bean counters, the accountants, they decided that there's an enormous lot of paperwork goes with storing fuel. It's complicated, it's expensive, there's a lot of regulations. They decided decades ago that it was far, far cheaper for the government to just buy the fuel as they wanted it, for the emergency services and the police to buy the fuel as they wanted it. Okay, so 14 days worth of bulk storage twice a month, 29 days worth of bulk storage twice a month. If you're counting with the full storage tanks, and if you count all of the fuel that's in transit on the roads in the B-double fuel tankers, if you count all the fuel that's in the service stations, okay, you can massage that figure up to being as high as 48 days worth. And here's the other fun little fact. Unless you've got an operable electric grid, then the cash register at the service station cannot tell the pump in the fuel bowser to suck motion lotion out of the underground tank. So even if there is fuel in the service station, you can't get at it unless you've got a hydrocarbon safe immersion pump with an independent power supply to lower down a hole and bring the fuel back up. So if anybody's thinking of coming to Australia in order to try to survive any kind of world cataclysmic apocalypse or economic financial collapse or Third World War, just forget it, because Australia's 6 or 7 weeks away from starvation and anarchy and total bloody collapse. And not only, but also, the last 238 years of white colonisation has completely destroyed the ecology necessary to try and live a traditional Aboriginal lifestyle. So I confidently predict that as soon as the fuel runs out, whether that be 43 days or 34 days or 17 days after the last boatload of refined transport fuel comes into Australia from Singapore, the Australian population will commence to starve. The population will drop by 50% per month, and it will continue to drop at that rate for somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And at the end of it, there will be somewhere between 2,000 and 20,000 Australians thinly scattered around the continent, probably out of walking distance from each other, and they will be the people who are capable of feeding themselves out of their own vegetable garden for a year or so and still having a vegetable garden, and doing that without using any fuel in the pump to irrigate it. Right? That is the situation that we currently live in here in Australia. So all those white South African farmers who think they've got a hard time in South Africa, stay there. You're better off where you are. Because thanks to the bean counters, Australia has a very limited future. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.